Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Overview of Global IT Accessibility Laws and Policies. I'm Sharon Spencer with IAAP, and before we get started, I just want to quickly review a few system items. Everyone should be logged into Adobe Connect, or you can follow along with the presentation that we provided and over the phone line. To access the presentation, there was a handout link in the confirmation email that you received when you registered or in the reminder email that was sent out just a few days ago. During the webinar today, if you want to ask questions, our speaker Ken Nakata does plan to stop for questions throughout and at the end. If you have a question, you can type it into Adobe Connect. You all should have access to the chat area. That's on the right-hand side of your screen. Just type into the text box for the chat area and hit enter or click on the send icon, and the questions will be posted, and Ken will address the questions when he gets to a good stopping point. For those of you who are on the phone, I have put the phone line on mute to guard against background noise. If there's time at the end of the webinar, we will open up to both the microphones and the phone lines. And to unmute your phone, you just press #6 and then *6 puts your phone back on mute. If you are hearing the audio over both your computer speakers and the phone, you can hang up the phone and listen via computer only, or you can turn off your computer speakers and listen via phone only. And there is the ability to mute your speakers through Adobe Connect. Lastly, I want to remind everybody that we will be recording this webinar. So again, let me thank all of you for joining us today for Overview of Global IT Accessibility Laws and Policies. Our speaker is Ken Nakata. Ken is the Director of the Accessibility Consulting Practice at CryptZone, which recently merged with High Software. And Ken directs a team to help organizations understand the legal and business drivers for accessibility, and then manages this change using both manual and automated testing solutions. And previously, Ken was a senior trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he was the federal government's lead attorney for the Section 508 implementation. So we're delighted to have Ken with us as today's speaker. So Ken, thank you again for doing this webinar for us, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Sharon. Good morning, everyone. As Sharon said, my name is Ken Nakata, and I direct the Accessibility Consulting Practice at CryptZone, which is formerly High Software. Our company provides enterprise scanning and encryption solutions that helps organizations meet their accessibility, privacy, and security needs. I'm also a board member of the IAAP, and CryptZone is a founding member of the IAAP. Before coming to High Software, which then merged into CryptZone, as Sharon said, I was a senior trial attorney in the disability rights section at the U.S. Department of Justice. And in that role, I used to wear a bunch of different hats, including investigating and litigating cases under the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 for about the first half of my career there, which was about 12 years. I also developed many of the department's web policies, which are still available on the Justice Department website today. But as Sharon said, what I'm probably most known for was my work on Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which really was the second half of my career at Justice. And in that role, I conducted the surveys of the federal government and co-authored the reports to the President and the Congress, and also helped develop some of the actual Section 508 standards, which we currently use that are available on the Access Board website today. Today's presentation is a really broad topic, and I've got a ton of material to cover. And I'd like to reserve questions to one of the 3 or 4 designated breaking spots that we've got in the presentation. But you can always contact me later if you have a question that comes up after the presentation. You can send me an email at ken.nakata@cryptzone.com. nevertheless, if you have a question at any time, feel free to type it into the chat session in Adobe Connect. I'm not going to be monitoring that section that closely during that time, during the presentation, because I always get sidetracked, really. But there's a strong possibility that, given our audience size, that somebody on the call will probably be able to answer your question when they see it. So I'll also use the chat window, the questions that you type into the chat window, to queue up questions to get to during one of those 3 or 4 breaking spots. Lastly, I should tell you that I always make full transcripts of my presentation for later recording and captioning. I just think it's a good way of remembering a presentation. And also, what I find is that when I'm giving a live presentation, often enough what happens is that I get sidetracked by a couple of questions, and next thing you know, I haven't been able to hit half my presentation. So the transcript is really all the things that I intended to say, even if I never got a chance to say them. I don't think that we're going to run into that problem today, but it's just a matter of course. It's just a matter of course, but that's what I do. So I also try to keep my slides relatively sparse on text. I don't believe in making a webinar into really an eye test, and so much of the content isn't on the slide. The slide content is really just intended just to kind of cue up the main topic of the conversation. But everything that I say is obviously going to be in the transcript. So if you feel like you missed something I said, you can certainly get the transcript that's being recorded right now from IAAP, but you can also get a copy from me by sending me an email at ken.nakata@cripzone.com. Of course, my transcript won't include the questions and answers. So again, if you'd like a transcript, feel free to contact me. Before we get started, I wanted to get a sense of who the audience is, and I wanted to take a quick poll to see what countries everybody is from, because we're talking about an international topic here. So I'm going to switch over to a quick poll here, and I just ask that you just click on the radio button to indicate what country you're from. And then as you'll see on the screen, what's happening is that we're getting real-time demographics here, so that we're able to tell, at a glance, where everybody's from. So if you could just take a couple seconds and just click on the appropriate radio button. If your window is small, you can scroll down to the bottom. If your country isn't listed there, there's some general overarching categories for other countries. So let's see, how are we doing? Okay, cool. Well, great. So it looks like, looking at the results right now, out of our 33 participants, the vast majority of you are from the U.S. I guess that's not a huge surprise. 82.3% of you are from the U.S. And following closely behind is Canada at 11.1%. Taiwan comes in at 5.56%. So I know that we were expecting a bunch of different countries to be participating in on the call, and I suspect that some of those people might be joining in later. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. Great, and let's move to the next slide. Okay, so today's presentation is titled An Overview of Global IT Accessibility Laws and Policies. But I'll be the first to admit, I'm an American lawyer, and I consider myself an expert only on U.S. disability rights laws, and only a select handful of them at that. I don't claim to be an expert in all the laws and policies of all the different nations of the world, and I don't think anybody that doesn't have an absolutely encyclopedic memory ever could. So, in other words, I consider myself only a student of international disability rights laws and policies, not an instructor. And so this presentation is really intended to get the conversation started, get the interest started. Their IAAP has, we've set up in IAAP areas for people to talk about international laws and policies, network international laws and policies, and in the IAAP community site. And I encourage you all to take advantage of that. So with the assumption that I don't know everything about all the different laws and policies of IT accessibility around the world, I can't give you a laundry list of different countries and their various approaches to IT accessibility. Frankly, even if I could, I don't think that that would be the right approach for three reasons. First, the ground is always shifting. Countries are creating new laws and policies almost every day, and we'll talk about some of the reasons for that in a little while. Second, so anything I tell you today is going to be likely outdated tomorrow. Second, having a law or policy on the books is meaningless if that law or policy isn't being implemented or enforced in an effective way. And as we'll see, this is a pretty common problem, and it's a source of some of the real gaps that we see today in IT accessibility. Third, many of these laws and policies are virtually identical to each other. And I don't think it would be useful for you to memorize a list of different names of different countries and names of different laws when a lot of them accomplish basically the same thing. And there's a reason for that, too, which you'll see in this presentation. Later, I'll be talking about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is hugely influential. If you want to really dig into all of the different countries, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, goes by the acronym OHCHR, tries to keep on top of how well all of these different countries that are implementing and ratified and implemented the UN Convention are doing with implementing the requirements of the UN Convention. And they try and keep a list of all of that information. Another great resource is the G3ICT, which surveys countries annually around the world and which we'll be talking about in this presentation, and which also coincidentally was absolutely vital to me. Axel Leblanc and James Thurston were absolutely essential for me while I was putting this presentation together. So instead, I believe that a more useful approach is to give you a general framework for understanding the different types of laws and policies. And then within that framework, we'll focus on 2 or 3 key areas that I think would be of the most value to you from a global perspective, and then to examine each of those areas. So to do that, whoops, sorry, let's see.
I'll get you back.
Okay, thank you.
Don't worry.
Okay. Great. So, so to do that, I'll be talking generally about each of these key areas that I see, and then give you a rough overview and a sense of what to expect. And then we'll make it a little bit more concrete by diving into a few examples from specific countries. But because I'm a U.S. lawyer and we have such a large U.S. audience, it would be a shame if we didn't also describe how some of those same key areas are approached from a U.S. perspective, so that you can make an easy comparison and contrast. So let's get started with a basic framework of the different types of laws, different types of IT policies and laws around the world. This rough categorization works in the U.S., but I think it also works for a lot of the other newer IT laws and accessibility laws that are springing up around the world. It's the way in which it's the framework I use to try and make sense of it all. So first, we've got laws that affect the obligation of governments. And in this category in the U.S., I would put things like Section 508, obviously. Section 508 requires the U.S. federal government to only buy accessible information and communication technology, or ICT. But I'd also put into this category all of the different international laws that require government websites to be accessible. Again, the focus here is on what the government needs to do. Second, we've got true civil rights laws. these laws are far broader than web pages or any ICT. Instead, they cover all of the rights of people with disabilities to access all aspects of society. This includes making the built environment accessible, like buildings, for instance, or providing sign language interpreters, or any of the other basic disability-related obligations that we normally think of in our day-to-day life. It just so happens, however, that these laws overlap with ICT accessibility and can heavily affect it, even if ICT is not specifically identified in those laws. For instance, a good example of that in the United States, we've got laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, as we'll see, has been changed around a bit by the courts and by the Justice Department to gradually include more and more ICT. It also includes things like the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the CRPD, and the plethora of laws around the world by countries that have ratified the UN Convention. And let's see, third, we've got laws that address access to specific technologies, such as hearing aid compatibility for telephones or specific captioning requirements. While the impact of these laws can be obviously far-reaching, they were initially designed to take care of very specific problems as opposed to wide-ranging problems like Section 508 or the ADA. These are much more tailored. For instance, in the United States, I put in this category the CVAA, which affects access to new communications technologies and to motion pictures. Around the globe, there are a huge number of laws and regulations that address more basic technologies. We're seeing a lot of laws and policies, for instance, that affect hearing aid compatibility around the world, something which the United States has done a pretty good job of taking care of already. Other than discussing web page accessibility, we won't be talking about this category of laws very much because these laws are too specific to the unique circumstances occurring within each country. Next, there are the laws that affect IT accessibility and education, laws and policies, I should say. In the United States, I'd put laws like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. However, in the international realm, there's a lot of new activity in terms of laws and policies that address accessible IT and education that are much more targeted than IDEA. While there's an abundance of activity around the world in this area, particularly in the policy realm, we won't be talking about this area because it's highly localized to the educational system in each country. So that means that today's presentation is going to focus really on two key areas. First, we're going to focus on laws and policies that affect government. Specifically, we'll look at two key areas in this category. First, we'll look at government procurement laws and policies that require ICT accessibility. Here, it's all about focus on the word procurement. And then we'll look at laws and policies that require government web pages to be accessible. Next, outside of just what the government has to do, we'll focus in on civil rights legislation that affects ICT accessibility. This third area, of course, includes the enormously influential CRPD. As I mentioned, we'll also talk about how the U.S. approaches each of these areas because in many cases, the U.S. follows a different approach from what's going on internationally. Also discussing the U.S. approach is important historically because the U.S. really was at the forefront of this, and the approach that the U.S. has taken has shaped the way in which the rest of the world now approaches accessibility. So with that framework, let's jump into the exciting world of government procurement. So procurement as a means of driving accessibility is fairly unique to the area of IT accessibility in comparison to, say, other areas of accessibility. The idea is that the government creates a law or policy that it's only going to procure accessible information or communication technology, and then uses its large purchasing power to create a strong market incentive to develop accessible technologies that eventually find their way into the mainstream market. This process works really well for information and communication technology because much of ICT is mass-produced. And once accessibility features are incorporated into products for the government, it would actually cost more for the vendors to not incorporate those same accessibility features into the consumer and retail versions of those same products. This is fundamentally different from the built environment because in the built environment, we have buildings that are uniquely built to each customer's specifications. So the way in which you build one doesn't necessarily affect the way you build another. Another key advantage of leveraging government procurement is to achieve accessibility is that the obligations are not imposed directly on the manufacturer. You can't label something like Section 508, for instance, as an unfunded mandate when accessibility is becoming a competitive feature that vendors are now using to compete against each other and to win new business. Another key feature of leveraging government procurement is that it encourages those far-reaching infrastructure changes both within the government agency but also within society as a whole. This makes it easier, for instance, to use individual accommodations such as assistive technology or employer-provided reasonable accommodations to access that technology. Unfortunately, because it has such far-reaching effects, procurement-based approaches are only one part of the solution, and they certainly don't offer a complete solution. Change happens really slowly, I think, in this area, and because it's the government that's being held to task, it's often difficult for private citizens to enforce those requirements. So we'll look at 3 different procurement models. Let's see. First, we'll look briefly at the United States. And it's strange, in a presentation on global IT law and policy, I'm starting with the United States. Because Section 508 really was the model that other countries have been looking to for a procurement-based approach. Next, we'll look at developments within the EU, particularly EN 301549 and the EU Procurement Directive. Obviously, between the EU and its 28 member states and the U.S., this represents a huge portion of the world's IT market. And this is between the EU and the U.S., it's a huge driver for accessible technology. And then lastly, we'll take a look at a very different procurement model that exists in Japan and manufacturers' adherence to the GIS standards over there. So let's briefly talk about Section 508 as it frames up the discussion of the EU Procurement Directive really well. I'll go through this really quickly. First, Section 508 was passed in 1986. And even 30 years ago, this Section 508 required that government buy accessible technology. But it wasn't until it was amended in 1998 that it became really effective in driving accessible IT procurement. The 1998 amendments were significant in 2 ways. First, Section 508A required the Access Board to develop accessibility standards for what accessible IT should look like. And these standards would then be incorporated, according to Section 508, into the Federal Acquisition Regs, which is a compendium of rules that all government procurement needs to strictly follow. If you've ever had to deal with federal government procurements, you'll know that the FAR is the Bible when it comes to government procurements. Second, Section 508F authorized private lawsuits against federal agencies that failed to abide by Section 508 in the procurement process. And while it's imperfect, Section 508 has been enormously successful, in my opinion, and really has reshaped the accessibility of ICT in the United States and around the world. Sure, it could be a lot more perfect, and there are a lot of instances where it has failed with agencies, but it really has, in the grand scheme of things, taking the view, now 15 years out, that it really has had such an enormous impact. Implementation of Section 508 has been uneven throughout the federal government, but I think it's the lead agencies, the ones that are taking Section 508 seriously, that have ensured that information and communication technology is far more accessible today than it was before Section 508 was amended back in 1998. So while Section 508 applies only to the federal government, most states have adopted, I should say. They've adapted Section 508, or they've adopted Section 508 for their own, to create their own analogs to Section 508 for their own procurements. Now, while the U.S. federal government is the single largest customer of IT in the world, the combined purchasing power of the state and local governments is even larger. The net effect in the United States is a strong market push for accessible technology. But it gets better than that with the EU. So the experience and success of the United States in using Section 508 as a tool for encouraging digital accessibility has led other countries to consider the same approach. Now, there's no country in the world that has the same buying power as the United States when it comes to ICT. But the European Union has, with its 28 member states, in combination has a buying power that really dwarfs the United States. And so for some time, the EU has been developing its own IT accessibility standards for public procurement. In 2005, the European Commission issued Mandate 376, what everybody just refers to as M376. And this required the 3 European standards bodies to develop ICT accessibility standards for public procurement within the EU. These standards bodies are CEN, which is the European Committee for Standardization, CENELEC, which is the European Committee for Electrotechnical Standardization, and ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standards Institute. Fulfilling M376 was divided into 2 phases. The first phase required an inventory of all of the worldwide accessibility standards and developing a basic testing and conformance criteria for those standards around the world. And so that work was completed in 2008. Phase 2 of the project focused on creating an actual European standard, an actual European procurement standard, which is designated as by the prefix EN. And this effort ultimately culminated in the publication of EN 301549 in 2014. So let's see, I think I'm actually behind on slides. There we go. In adopting the EN, the authors drew upon the experience of Japan, Denmark, Ireland, and in particular the United States to ensure international harmonization of accessibility standards. Indeed, I think that one of the shortcomings of the EN's software and electronic document section is their heavy reliance on WCAG 2.0 AA, a concept that was initiated by the U.S. Access Board's unilateral insistence on applying WCAG 2.0 beyond the web in its 2011 Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking for the Section 255 and 508 standards. Unlike the U.S. draft standards, however, the EN does a much better job at giving clear guidance to IT vendors, even in the software and electronic document sections. As an aside, that's one of my criticisms right now of the U.S. Access Board standards. In fact, the EN has been highly influential as an international standard, and other countries, such as Australia, have occasionally borrowed from it for some of their own procurements. There's a lot of interest in submitting EN 301549 to ISO, which is the International Standards Organization, to become a worldwide benchmark for IT accessibility. There's a lot of political wrangling around this, but at this point, ETSI, one of those 3 organizations, ETSI has recommended that it become an ISO standard, but CEN and CENELEC, the other 2 organizations, haven't yet voiced their support for that. There was some talk about the the EN becoming what they call fast-tracked into an ISO standard, but that probably isn't going to happen because of some disability rights organizations within Europe have voiced concerns that some areas, notably the sections that deal with real-time text, should receive a bit more careful coverage as those standards work their way through ISO. It's not that anyone opposes the idea, really, of the EN becoming an ISO standard. It's really just the speed at which it progresses and the thoughtfulness of analyzing certain sections that is causing a little bit of heartache for some people. I mean, virtually everyone supports the idea of an international ISO standard framed on EN 301549 in one way or another. And the prospect of this becoming an ISO standard, whether it looks exactly like EN 301549 or not, is really an exciting goal for government, industry, and particularly for people with disabilities. ISO standards carry a whole new level of respect among governments around the world. First, an ISO standard is developed with the participation of all of the international standards bodies. And second, an ISO standard represents a worldwide consensus on those basic standards. So, for instance, it's highly unlikely that the United States would adopt the EN standards because they're not American standards, of course, and because the participation of the U.S. in the EN process was really only as a bystander or as an advisor. We really weren't a participant in that because we didn't have any stake in the outcome. These same factors, though, don't apply if the EN becomes an ISO standard, and there would be much greater pressure for the U.S. to conform to those same standards. So, while EN 301549 is a great set of standards, its real impact depends, of course, on ensuring that it makes its way into the procurement requirements for each of the member states. Well, it just so happens that the EU was almost simultaneously updating its procurement system when EN 301549 was issued. In February 2014, the EU issued Directive 2014/24, which I just refer to as the EU Procurement Directive. And this directive was geared towards streamlining and improving public procurement throughout the EU. So this directive is really big. It encompasses a lot more than just accessibility, and it's really an overall revision of the procurement process within the EU. But it does include several key provisions specifically tied to accessibility. Specifically, paragraph 2 of the directive requires that all member states consider the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as part of its procurements. Second, in addition, Article 42 of the directive requires member states to create accessibility standards as part of their procurements. Now, while it's obvious that member states are going to be looking to EN 301549 when they're creating their own standards, it isn't entirely clear that that's mandatory. The directive states, quote, where mandatory accessibility requirements are adopted by a legal act of the Union, technical specifications shall, as far as accessibility criteria for persons with disabilities or designed for all users are concerned, be defined by reference thereto. However, it isn't clear that the EN is a, quote, legally adopted standard in the same way that a so-called harmonize standard in the EU would be. The EU, for anyone who's ever had to deal with EU law or policy, these little differences in naming are of incredible importance, and it isn't entirely clear that the EN carries that same weight that would make it mandatory. If it does, it may very well, but I'm not a true scholar on EU law. So regardless, in the absence of any other practical standard, however, EN 301549 is likely going to be adopted by the European nations. It's just a question of whether it's mandatory. Member states have until April 18th, 2016 to enact their own laws, regulations, or procedures to comply with the EU procurement directive. Thus, we should see a widespread adoption of EN 301549 across Europe in the coming year. Personally, I think Section 508 and the EU procurement directive represent the way of the future for ICT accessibility. Back in 1998, when Section 508 was amended, the concept of using procurement to drive ICT accessibility was really revolutionary. Even then, however, it was clear that countries would have to address the issue of information and communication technology accessibility, and that a procurement-driven approach could make far-reaching infrastructure changes very fast and effectively. While EN 301549 and its relative, with EN 301549 and its relative harmonization with the latest Section 508 NPRM, a clearer international standard for ICT accessibility is slowly beginning to come into focus. And if ISO can create a uniform international accessibility standard using the EN as its base, then it will be very easy for nations around the world to create an effective and well-justified procurement standard that can further drive accessibility in information and communication technology. So, in addition to the U.S. and the EU, Japan's the other obvious nation to consider in terms of information and communication technology procurement processes. Apart from being a huge manufacturer of ICT and provider of ICT solutions, Japan's also fascinating because it represents a distinct twist on the U.S. and the EU procurement experience. Japan's not a country that can afford to take accessibility lightly. I'm sorry that this graph is so small, but it represents the point that I'm trying to make. In 2010, approximately 2.9% of the Japanese population, or about 3.7 million people, had a disability. This number isn't terribly unusual, and it's probably an underestimation based upon the way in which the survey was taken. But this number is likely to increase, and in a very dramatic way, and it's because of Japan's aging population. In 2013, approximately 1/4, or 25%, of the population was age 65 or over. This percentage is going to just about double by 2040. In fact, of all the countries in the world, Japan and Italy have the two oldest populations, a reality that drives accessibility in both countries. We won't have a chance to really discuss Italy's Stenka law. We could during the break if anyone has a question about that, but it's also a very strong accessibility law. From a Western perspective, Japan's also something of a mystery. In contrast to the United States or even the EU, procurement processes in Japan are hardly transparent, and they tend to be shrouded in obscurity. And that would be exactly the kind of country where mandatory procurement standards shouldn't succeed. Yet Japan has well-considered accessibility standards and a relatively good degree of conformance by manufacturers. So how is this possible? Well, the answer lies in a basic cultural difference in the relationship between government and industry that I think is somewhat unique to Japan. In Japan, industry standards are taken very seriously, and they carry a high degree of respect among Japanese manufacturers. The JISC, or JISC, the Japan Industrial Standards Committee, is responsible for developing standards. Development for accessibility standards started way back in 2004, and now those standards, what's called the JIS X8341, provides a comprehensive set of standards for information technology, including web pages, telecommunications, software, hardware, just about anything. These standards are regularly updated by the JISC and are harmonized with other standards, such as WCAG 2.0. While Japanese industry tends to adhere to the JISC standards, even when they're not really completely mandatory, Japanese companies also recognize that accessibility is a big market driver, and major companies develop products specifically targeting the aging and disabled population. On the other hand, Japan's not perfect in its industry-driven model. Specifically, while its procurement laws do require accessibility, do require that accessibility can be considered, some research has shown that this has very weak oversight and relatively poor compliance. Disability advocates in Japan may argue that Japan's procurement policies need to be updated to create better compliance and better enforcement. An American disability advocate would assert that trusting industry to follow the JIS X8341 is like leaving a fox to watch a hen house. Nevertheless, while IT accessibility procurement in Japan could be improved, it's undeniable that Japan has done remarkably well with what it has in terms of IT accessibility and has one of the best sets of accessibility standards available. So before we switch to talking about government websites and the area of laws and policies, I'm going to take a couple minutes to look for any questions that you might have. So let's see, looking in the chat session. If you have any questions, yeah, feel free to type them into the chat session. Okay. Looks like I'm not seeing any so far. That's fine. We'll have another one in just a couple of minutes. And we seem to be going right on pace. So if you see anything, Sharon, just let me know. Okay, so moving right along. So in addition to national procurement laws, another key area for global IT laws and policies is in the area of government websites. Most of this activity, quite frankly, has taken place completely outside the United States, despite the fact that everybody knows about things like the Target decision. Specifically, here we're going to be talking about laws that require government websites to be accessible. Around the world, this has been a hotbed of activity. In fact, shortly after WCAG 2.0 was developed, New Zealand required that its government websites had to conform to WCAG 2.0 level AA. And this set off a landslide of nations around the world that required WCAG 2.0 AA compliance. Since then, some of the other countries that have adopted WCAG 2.0 by law or policy as its yardstick for website accessibility includes Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Hong Kong, India, Japan, and Korea. These are only a few of the countries that require government sites to be accessible, and the number is growing every day. Indeed, of the 28 countries in the European Union, for instance, all but 4 of them have a law or policy, however informal it might be, requiring that government websites be accessible. In part, this landslide, oops, I think I'm behind a slide. In part, this landslide of activity responds to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which we'll talk about later when we talk about the civil rights laws that affect ICT accessibility. But for now, let's just say that in addition to complying with the convention, making government sites accessible is the first and simplest step that a government can take to ensure that its programs, services, and activities are accessible to its citizens with disabilities. I emphasize government here because with the exception of just a handful of countries like the UK, Australia, South Korea, Norway, United States, Italy, few other countries have gone the extra step of requiring that private websites be accessible. In this conversation, I'd like to briefly talk about New Zealand, which was because it was the first country to adopt WCAG 2.0 for its government websites, and because it's pretty typical, I think, of the kind of development that we're seeing around the world. I'd then like to talk about the EU Web Directive, which has the potential to have an enormous impact on European government websites. And I'd also like to talk about South Korea, because South Korea has a very unique approach to web accessibility. But we'll talk about that as part of the civil rights legislation discussion. Obviously, as you can see, this categorization of mine is not entirely perfect. There's a significant overlap between the categories. And finally, I would also like to talk about the very, very confusing way that the United States achieves web accessibility for its government sites. So, first, New Zealand. In New Zealand, the rights of people with disabilities stem from two broad civil rights laws, the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act from 1990 and the Human Rights Act of 1993. These laws are meant to be read together, and they prohibit discrimination on a number of bases, including disability, within New Zealand. And one of the things that it does is it compels the government to refrain from discriminating against people with disabilities. So there is a portion of it that has a very distinctly government twist to it. In addition, New Zealand has ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and so it must abide by its requirements, including the requirement to make information available to its citizens with disabilities. While many countries have adopted laws specifically addressing web accessibility, many other countries have developed policies instead that extend local anti-discrimination legislation to require that government websites be accessible. And New Zealand's an example of this latter approach. In 2009, the New Zealand government issued its first Government Web Standards 2.0, which required government sites to conform to WCAG 2.0 AA. This made New Zealand the first government to specifically require government websites to actually conform to WCAG 2.0 AA. Sorry, again, I'm behind a slide. These standards were superseded in July 2013 by the Web Accessibility Standards 1.0. Yes, the numbering seems odd to go from 2.0 to 1.0, but it was also the name of the standards also changed, so that partially accounts for that. One important point to mention while discussing standards is the need for close harmonization between WCAG 2.0 AA and local versions of it. Even changing the standards a little bit can cause a lot of confusion and encourages even wider divergences by other countries. Initially, this was a bit of a problem in New Zealand. I think it was an even larger problem in Korea. But the forces that be have made sure that that divergence is not that great. So moving away from just New Zealand, let's talk about what's going on in Europe. In December 2012, the European Commission proposed a directive to address the accessibility of public sector websites. Even though the vast majority of member states already had some sort of law or policy addressing the accessibility of public sites, further concentration was thought was needed in this area. Currently, this proposed directive is making its way through the EU system and will hopefully be issued shortly before, or maybe in conjunction with the European Accessibility Act, which will provide a uniform and broad set of rights for people with disabilities within the EU. While the exact terms of the EU directive are still being worked out, its focus is almost certainly going to be on public sector sites within the EU. The initial draft focused on a uniform approach to web accessibility and a requirement for monitoring and reporting of the accessibility of those sites. It's unclear of the extent to which it's going to cover private sector sites, but it may very well cover private sector sites that are quasi-public, that are somehow performing a public service. The need for a stronger and more effective impetus for web accessibility in Europe was recently highlighted by a report that was prepared for the European Commission. This report is titled The Study on Assessing and Promoting E-Accessibility in Europe, and it goes by the shorthand name of the MEAC report. Funkanu, which is a disability rights research organization based in Sweden, and it's also a founding member of the IAAP, examined website accessibility um, while two other disability rights organizations reviewed telecom and television accessibility. So the MEAC report included a review of websites in the 27 member states between 2011 and 2013. Earlier I said that there are 28 member states in the EU. Croatia was the 28th member state, and it didn't become a member until July 2013. So it really was at the tail end of the preparation of the MEAC report, so its accessibility wasn't included in the MEAC report. So there are 27 states that were reviewed. The report also looked at 4 other non-EU countries. Those were Norway, Canada, the U.S., and Australia as benchmarks because they have a well-established history in accessibility. Despite the fact that all but 3 of those 27 EU countries had some form of law or policy requiring web accessibility for government sites, the EU in general performed pretty poorly, and they performed less favorably in comparison to the non-EU countries, Norway, Canada, US, and Australia. The specific findings and recommendations of the MEAC report make for over 100 pages of really dense reading, but the poor performance and variation among member states suggests that there's a strong need for harmonized obligations within the EU and possible monitoring on an EU-wide basis. Certainly the web section that was prepared by Funkanu within the MEAC report highlight the importance of a comprehensive and effective action from the EU. And this is going to likely be reflected in the EU Web Directive. If anything, the MEAC report gives fuel to the fire to the idea that stronger oversight, monitoring, and compliance mechanisms is needed within the EU for web accessibility. Thus, I believe that it's likely that the EU Web Directive is going to take a pretty strong position with respect to web accessibility because the baby steps of the member states by enacting their own laws or policies for achieving web accessibility so far have yielded very few benefits. Let's see. In comparison to the rest of the world, the United States is really a mess, quite frankly, when it comes to government website accessibility. I should rephrase that. Yes, government websites in the United States need to be accessible, and as the MEAC report shows, we do a relatively good job at it. The mess that I've referred to comes in explaining why this is the case. I'll give you the short answer now, but a lot of the discussion will have to wait also to the civil rights discussion that comes next. Unlike the rest of the world, the U.S. doesn't have any specific law or policy that specifically addresses website accessibility on a government-wide basis, other than, say, informal executive memoranda and things like that. But there's no law, there's no specific legislation, I should really say, that really compels the United States to make sure its government websites be accessible. For federal government websites, accessibility is required, I think, mostly because of Section 508, but there's some wrinkles here. First, Section 508 applies to electronic and information technology that's developed, procured, maintained, or used. Those 4 verbs, develop, procure, maintained, or used, by the federal agencies. Thus, websites technically need to be accessible because they're maintained or used by federal agencies. However, enforcement of Section 508, as I talked about earlier, is only tied to one of those verbs, procured. So it's only tied to procurements. Thus, it would seem that the requirement for federal agencies to make their websites accessible isn't enforceable because they usually don't buy their websites. Fortunately, or unfortunately, I should say, it adds a little bit of a mess to this analysis. The General Services Administration, or GSA, has taken the position that sites that are developed by contractors constitutes a procurement. Thus, any federal agency can be held liable under Section 508 for its websites if it was worked on by a contractor. What about sites that aren't worked on by contractors? Well, while Section 508 covers these sites, the requirements aren't enforceable, as we just mentioned. But instead, we have to rely on older civil rights laws like Section 504, which we'll talk about in the next section. But before we get to that next section, it probably would help to take a little break here and see if there's any other questions that have come up.
And there are two questions, Ken. Sarah has a question, if you see that, and Earl has a question.
Okay. Okay. So the question is, how does the New Zealand Web Accessibility Standard differ from WCAG 2.0? Well, let me see. To tell you the truth, I really am not. I know that it was initially there was a bit of a divergence initially, but New Zealand wasn't really as much of a problem as some of the Far East Asia countries like Korea and Japan, as far as divergence from the WCAG standards. The new version, which is the Web Accessibility Standard 1.0, I think is very closely in alignment with WCAG 2.0. But if there's someone else that has a different opinion about that, yeah, definitely chime in on the chat. The problem with that they had with the Far East Asia countries in part had to do with localization of the way in which reading order took place. So, you know, there's this a subtle bias under WCAG that for pages that read left to right, then up and down, as opposed to up and down from right to left. And so Japan, for instance, tweaked its WCAG standards to accommodate that and other distinctly local effects. So let's see, another question came in from, Earl. Yeah, so let's see, the chat window is moving up and down on me. With most countries and standards adopting WCAG 2.0 AA, is there a general opinion that AAA is unlikely to ever be adopted? Yeah, actually, I don't think AAA is ever going to be adopted. The reason is because AAA really is a much higher level of standards. And even, I remember digging through WCAG 2.0, and it said that there's some language in the WCAG 2.0 standards that actually calls this out and says, you know, that that really WCAG 2.0 AAA isn't practical for most sites to be using, and that it's recommended almost as a best practice under unusual circumstances. So given that language in WCAG 2.0, I can't pinpoint exactly where it is right now. Yeah, I think it's highly unlikely that governments are going to be moving towards WCAG AAA. I also have a feeling more of a pragmatic feeling about standards. And we see this a lot with the arguments between government and industry and disability rights groups. There's always this movement and desire, I think, for some people to just keep raising the bar to a higher and higher standard when that doesn't achieve better compliance. And the example that I always use is, you know, like say you've got a small town and you notice that people are speeding through the school zones. Well, one way that you could prevent them from speeding through the school zone is you could put up a sign saying, you know, school zone, speed limit 20 miles an hour as you're going through the school zone. And you still notice that people are speeding through the school zone. Well, the way in which you could toughen that up is you could do one of two things. You could say, well, it's a school zone, so people aren't respecting 15 miles an hour. Make them drive 20 miles an hour. Make them drive 15 miles an hour. In other words, you raise the standard. Or you could put up some sort of monitoring, like automatic cameras, or you have a police officer waiting there in the school zone to ticket people as they're going through the school zone. I think the better way is stronger enforcement. I don't necessarily think that the solution necessarily is better standards. And as we've seen, a lot of countries in Europe have adopted WCAG 2.0 AA, and they're doing a pretty awful job at complying with it. And so moving to AAA isn't really going to accomplish anything. So let's see. Another question. Ken, does DOJ require annual reports from the agencies on how Section 508 applies to their systems? Yes, it does. It requires, well, in a way, it requires that that agencies report on their accessibility every 2 years, and that the Department of Justice issue a report to the President and Congress every 2 years. Actually, the requirement ties to the report. So every 2 years, Justice Department is supposed to prepare a report to the President and Congress. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a survey every 2 years. They could have an ongoing survey for, it could be every week for as far as justice is concerned. But they typically do a survey every 2 years because they have to prepare a report every 2 years. That report writing has fallen by the wayside, quite frankly, since I left the Justice Department. And that has to do not because I was so great at doing it. It's just that my departure also happens to coincide with a reduction in resources to GSA as far as helping us put together the surveys and a change of administration and things like that. So there was the Justice Department hasn't been fulfilling its obligation of doing the survey and the report every 2 years since I left. Let's see. From Michelle, when you talk about the procurement-contractor relation for Section 508, is the contractor a vendor? Does the contractor include contingent IXT workforce? ICT workforce. Let's see. When they mean contractor, they mean anybody who's, say, on site who is doing work at a government agency, either as a vendor, such as, say, Microsoft Consulting, for instance, would be a vendor, but also around the Beltway and in the federal government, there are large consulting firms like Booz Allen and SAIC and companies like that that provide a lot of manpower to government agencies. And when you walk around a government agency, there are people walking around a floor that may be IT support or maybe not IT support that are basically indistinguishable from the federal employees. They're full-time staff. They have an office. They, work just as hard as all the federal employees. They just don't receive any of the benefits of the federal employees. They get them through their contractor. All of those people are contractors. If any of those people touch the website, if they update the website, if they modify the website, whatever they did constitutes a procurement for that portion of the site. So yeah, it really is far-reaching. So it definitely includes IT staff to the extent that they're contractors that are just happen to be on site and working on it. So it really is a far-reaching effect under 508. Okay, great. So let's see. I think that's it for questions. So let's keep moving along. I think we're pretty much on schedule. And let me see where I was. We're at slide 16, right? That can't be right. Oh, yeah. No, I guess that is right. Okay. So on to civil rights. So moving past the area of government websites, I'd like to now shift gears a little bit and talk about civil rights laws around the world that affect IT accessibility. Historically, it's been the United States that was the early leader in this area. Over 40 years ago, It's hard to imagine 40 years ago. The United States passed the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which prohibited federal grantees initially, and then later federal agencies, from discriminating against people with disabilities. Then in 1990, it passed, the slide is wrong, it says 1992. It should say 1990. Then in 1990, it passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which has been commonly described as the most powerful civil rights legislation since the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The ADA fundamentally changed the landscape for people with disabilities in the U.S. and worldwide. Shortly after the passage of the ADA, just a few years after, countries such as the UK and Australia passed their own civil rights legislation to protect the rights of people with disabilities, and this is all largely framed on the ADA. And then in 2006, the United Nations issued the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or UNCRPD, which has become a worldwide driver for accessibility, for disability rights laws around the world. When the ADA and earlier legislation, such as the rehabilitation, such as that in, the UK and Australia was passed, internet and other ICT accessibility wasn't really considered an important civil right. Back in 1990, we hardly knew that the internet existed. By 2006, however, ICT accessibility was a key area of civil rights, and that's largely, I think, due to the influence of Section 508. Thus, the UN Convention and most of the civil rights laws that were created in countries that ratified the UN Convention all include reference to ICT accessibility, whereas the older laws don't. First, I think it would be really useful to briefly talk about how the U.S. civil rights legislation fits in with technology like the internet, because it's a model that fits well with the other older legislation, such as in Australia. And in the UK, well, in the UK up until the passage of, in the UK there was the Disability Discrimination Act fairly early on, but that was recently changed with the passage of the Equality Act in 2010. We'll talk about that later. Basically, with the U.S. and Australia and other countries, we're trying to take older laws and fit technology into them, fit technologies that didn't exist when those laws were passed into those laws in a way that all makes sense. So this discussion about U.S. law is going to go really fast, so hold on to your seats. Earlier I talked about Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which was really more of a procurement law than a civil rights law. Another section of the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, requires that the federal government programs, services, and activities have to be fully accessible to and usable by qualified individuals with disabilities. As this includes websites and other technologies for providing information to the public, it provides another avenue for requiring the federal government to make its technology accessible. Unfortunately, neither Section 504 nor any of the other U.S. civil rights laws that I'll be talking about in this section include any specific standards for technology. Thus, a federal agency could assert that it provided comparable access to information on its website by allowing the citizen to request the same information over the phone. Apart from the federal government, local governments and private companies have civil rights obligations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title II of the ADA affects state and local governments, and it's basically identical to Section 504 for all intents and purposes. Thus, programs, services, and activities that are offered through state and local government websites need to be accessible, but as in the case of Section 504, that doesn't necessarily mean that the website has to follow specific design requirements, and that a state or local government could get around the requirements by, say, having someone sit by a telephone 24 hours a day. There's a document on the ada.gov site titled Accessibility of State and Local Government Websites to People with Disabilities. And this is one of the documents that I authored shortly before I left the Justice Department back in 2004, and that provides guidance in this area. Private sector websites are covered by Title III of the ADA, which requires effective communication for people with disabilities unless doing so would impose an undue burden. Again, however, a defendant can avoid making its website or other technology accessible if communication can be effectively provided in an alternate manner. In all these cases, it's a question of whether the alternative is really effective. And so in a lot of the lawsuits that we see, it wasn't effective, or it didn't provide the same benefits for people with disabilities. Obviously, there's a lot of ambiguity in this area, and particularly in the coverage of information and communication technologies under these older civil rights laws. It's a bit unsettling, and there's a strong push for greater clarity. So to this end, the Justice Department currently has 2 rulemakings underway to clarify the obligations under Title II and Title III for websites. Also the rulemaking will also include whether specific design standards such as WCAG 2.0 need to be followed. In the meantime, the Justice Department has gone about investigating complaints against public and private sector websites, and it's required that public and private sector sites conform to standards like WCAG 2.0 AA in settlement agreements. But because they're settlement agreements, they don't carry any value as precedent. In addition, and this is a key point, in addition to federal laws like Section 504 and the ADA, there's also state laws. And while the National Federation for the Blind, they effectively sued Target Corporation, partially under ADA Title III, but the real strength of their lawsuit, which this portion of the suit that got them their $6 million in penalties, that portion all came under California's Unruh Act. In fact, I've always asserted that state laws like Unruh, which we could talk about if anyone has a question about that during the next question and answer period, provides a much, much more effective deterrent to inaccessible technology than federal civil rights laws do right now. Without question, though, however, the strongest force encouraging other countries, not the United States, to recognize the rights of people with disabilities is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that we've been talking about, or the CRPD, or I like to call it the UN CRPD. The United Nations has long supported the rights of people with disabilities. The 1980s was the decade of the disabled persons, and throughout the 1980s and the 90s, there was some movement towards an international convention to eliminate discrimination against people with disabilities. But frankly, all of these efforts went nowhere. Then, starting in 2000, the tide was beginning to change. And then suddenly, all of a sudden, by 2006, a draft standard was created. And at that point, that draft convention became the fastest human rights treaty in UN history to be negotiated and adopted. When the convention was released in 2007, it was hugely successful. At latest count, it's been signed by 159 countries, and of those countries, ratified by 154. It's also the first UN treaty that elevates access to IT as a fundamental human right. So by working in this area, IAAP and all of us are really breaking new ground in supporting this new internationally recognized human right. In this context, it's important to notice that there's a difference between signing a convention and ratifying one. When a country signs a convention or a treaty, it agrees with the principles set forth in that treaty, but it doesn't necessarily agree to be bound by its terms. In other words, it's really an agreement in principle with the convention or a treaty, and it's an informal commitment not to do anything to undermine it. So that's signing the convention. But when a country goes further and ratifies a convention, it agrees to be bound by its terms, and it agrees to enact legislation to fulfill all of the requirements and commitments that are set forth in that convention. This distinction is really important because the United States is a signatory to the convention, but we haven't ratified it. And for Americans, this is really an embarrassment for two reasons. First, because the United States has historically been a leader in recognizing disability rights, it has very, very little to do in order to meet the requirements of the convention. In other words, we've got nothing to lose by by ratifying the convention. Second, the United States, I should say, we can contrast that with other countries, which have to enact all new legislation and create all new processes for the UN Convention. The U.S. hardly has to do anything, hardly has to do any of that because we already have so much of that. So there's no reason for us not to ratify the convention. Second, the United States is enormously influential as one of the world's leading economies, and obviously as the most vocal champion of democracy around the world. Yet we lag behind the rest of the world in agreeing to the basic commitments that are set forth in the Convention for people with disabilities. While the great majority of countries have ratified the Convention, the absence of the United States provides a really good excuse for those other laggards who also haven't ratified the Convention. So the UN Convention is long. It's really complex. And it begins with the most basic human rights for people with disabilities and extends into civil rights that people with disabilities should enjoy if they want to participate as meaningfully as citizens in any modern society. The structure and content of the UN Convention goes well beyond the scope of this webinar, but there are two essential takeaways about the convention that I think are relevant for this webinar. First, the UN Convention is the number one reason that countries around the world have created new constitutional provisions, laws, regulations, or policies that recognize the rights of people with disabilities. It really does change the way things happen around the world. Second, Article 9 of the Convention specifically addresses the right to information and communication technology as a key component of accessibility. And consequently, many countries have directly or indirectly responded to this requirement by requiring laws that ensure that government or public websites be accessible. So a lot of the stuff that we talked about earlier about government websites is strongly influenced by the CRPD. With regard to information and communication technology, the convention requires three key commitments from member states. First, it requires countries that ratify the convention to adopt accessibility standards of one form or another. And in large measure, this accounts for the strong interest around the world in developments in the United States in Section 508 and in Europe in things like EN 301549. Second, it requires public and private sector implementation of ICT accessibility. Hence, we see things like public websites needing to be accessible and local legislation. And third, it requires member states to promote the use of information and communication technology by people with disabilities. So while the UN Convention has been obviously has huge potential and is extremely influential, how is it actually performed? I'll be the first to admit I'm not an expert in international civil rights laws. It's way too broad and complex a topic that is even made more murky by differences in language, culture, and legal systems. And I don't think that anyone could really get a truly bird's-eye view of everything. But to get around these problems, the Global Initiative for Inclusive Information and Communication Technology, or G3ICT, together with Disabled Peoples International, or DPI, has put together progress reports on the convention's ICT implementation using local experts and attorneys from countries around the world. Their 2013 report includes local experts and attorneys from 76 countries, including 74 countries that ratified the convention at that time. And that represents 72% of the world's population and 81% of all the ratifying countries. For our purposes, this report is critical for two data points. First, 85% of countries that were surveyed include a constitutional provision, a law, or regulation that sets forth the rights of people with disabilities. Most of these countries simply didn't have disability rights legislation before the UN Convention. And so the CRPD has been hugely influential in establishing the rights of people with disabilities in many of those countries. Second, 50% of these countries have a definition of accessibility in their legislation that includes information technology as a basic civil right. This fact clearly shows the effect of the convention. Also, by building accessibility into the internet and related technologies, we're ensuring a better tomorrow and an infrastructure of digital accessibility. Unfortunately, not all is good news. Yes, the UN Convention has had a great influence on civil rights legislation for people with disabilities around the world. In addition, it's led to the inclusion of information and communication technology as part of that accessibility. However, in most countries, implementation of the convention when it comes to information and communication technology pretty much stops there. As this table shows on the slide, relatively few countries do a good job with having programs or policies in place for ICT accessibility implementation. For instance, 85% of countries don't have copyright exceptions. This means that digital media, such as electronic books, cannot be made accessible, and this obviously impacts students with disabilities around the world. Similarly, 69% of countries don't have good policies or programs for ATM or kiosk accessibility. 65% don't provide for telephone accessibility, either wireless or landline. However, the story is slightly brighter in the area of websites and television. 54% of countries don't have policies or programs for website accessibility. But on the other hand, that suggests that 66% do, in fact, have some policy. And only 29% of countries don't provide for television accessibility, again implying that 71% do. We don't have time to examine each of these data points, but the key takeaway here is that while countries obviously mean well by adopting civil rights legislation to protect people with disabilities, and may even create policies for key technologies such as website accessibility, very few countries actually follow through and ensure that information and communication technologies fully and truly accessible to users with disabilities. A number of countries in the EU also follow a civil rights model for addressing inaccessible IT. This slide only shows a handful of the dozens of laws around the world that address information technology accessibility in one form or another from a civil rights approach. For instance, there's the Disability Discrimination Act in Australia, the Disability Discrimination Act, both in Australia, it goes by the same name, in Australia from 2002, and in South Korea from 2008. The Act on Equal Employment for Disabled Persons in Germany from 2002, and the Equality Act in the UK from 2010. As I mentioned before, the Equality Act was preceded by the Disability Discrimination Act, I believe, also from 1992. That precedes it by a fair number of years. In general, most of this legislation follows the basic pattern of the ADA. By this, I mean I mean this in the sense that the laws set forth the basic rights of people with disabilities and establishes the obligations in the public and private sector to avoid discrimination against people with disabilities. Fortunately, many of these laws are newer than the ADA and have addressed technology directly, thus avoiding all those legal complexities that I just talked about earlier that plague the ADA. To me, three of the countries that have done the most interesting work in this area are the UK, South Korea, and Norway. Each of these countries has taken a very different approach towards ICT accessibility. They're also three of the only countries, in addition to the US and Australia, where private sector websites fall under the scope of the legislation and where we actually have seen private sector organizations being held to task for having inaccessible sites. So I'd like to briefly review the civil rights laws in each of those three countries and examine their impact. First, there is the United Kingdom. The UK has a long history of recognizing the rights of people with disabilities. I was mistaken when I said it was 1992. It was 1995 that it created the Disability Discrimination Act. And this was largely responsive to the Americans with Disabilities Act of the United States. And it established civil rights legislation to protect the rights of people with disabilities in the UK. The UK is very effective in expanding the DDA to require website accessibility for the public sector, and on occasion for key entities in the private sector. One of the things that they did was they created PAS, which stands for Publicly Available Standard. PAS 78, which was published by the British Standards Institute in 2006. This was part of, and this is a set of web accessibility standards based on WCAG 1.0 that was designed to help facilitate compliance with the DDA in the area of web accessibility. Then in 2010, the UK bolstered its civil rights legislation in a novel way by creating a much broader Equality Act of 2010. This is an all-encompassing law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender, race, disability, religious beliefs, sexual orientation, and age. I think that's all the factors. In doing so, it provided greater protection than the DDA, which was consequently repealed throughout the UK, except in Northern Ireland, where much of the Equality Act does not apply. More importantly, however, it created a central agency, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, to oversee enforcement of the Equality Act against public and private sector entities. Around the same time, PAS 78 was updated and replaced by a full British standard called a BS 8878 in late 2010. BS 8878 really isn't a standard to the same extent that PAS 78 is. It's really more of a process standard. Yes, it's a standard, but it's more focused on the process as opposed to the specific design requirements. And it sets forth a process for implementing web accessibility, which will hopefully ensure that WCAG 2.0 implementation can be achieved much more efficiently. What's remarkable to me, however, about the UK evolution of disability rights is that it's no longer pigeonholed in a separate disability rights law. In passing the Equality Act of 2010, the UK established a place for disability rights alongside more traditional areas of civil rights, such as race and gender-based discrimination, and created a common agency for oversight and enforcement. And this is good and bad. While this may be a more efficient way of achieving civil rights enforcement across the board, it carries with it the risk that disability rights could get overlooked compared to the other forms of discrimination. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next decade, but my hunch is that we'll be seeing a lot more activity in IT accessibility over the coming years in the UK. Okay. Wow, I don't have much time left. South Korea is also fascinating. It's often an overlooked area where civil rights legislation has combined with a holistic approach that's achieved a remarkable degree of digital accessibility. Their work began in 2005 to address web accessibility and digital divide issues across a number of factors, not just accessibility, including age, disability, income level, education level, and even whether they even have special digital divide programs for North Korean refugees. In 2008, Korea passed the Disability Discrimination Act, which covers the private and public sector. Then in 2009, they created the National Informatization Act, which addressed ICT accessibility and web accessibility, created learning opportunities to close the digital divide, and established a new agency, the National Information Society Agency, or NIA, to deal with accessibility. Then, drawing on its research, it created a phased-in approach for achieving web accessibility, starting first with the large central governments, then smaller regional governments, and then large corporations, and then smaller companies, over a process between 2009 to 2013, thus affording smaller companies the most amount of time. It also conducted surveys among disadvantaged groups and created learning opportunities to close the digital divide. All this has yielded amazing results. NIA's held classes, free classes for over 10 million people, including a large number of people with disabilities, and encouraged internet usage across the board, but particularly for people with disabilities. In 2002, for instance, only 22.4% of people with disabilities used the internet. But by 2013, because of this digital divide work, they've doubled that number. So now, more than doubled that number. So now 56.7% of people with disabilities in the UK use the internet. Korea probably leads the world in its commitment towards overcoming the digital divide. And I'm just amazed by the effectiveness with which they've done it. On the slide, I've included several resources that talk about their ability to overcome the digital divide. What's remarkable to me about the Korea experience is how comprehensive and logical it was. Korea based its approach on careful research and created an agency, the NIA, to overcome the digital divide. And they used a very logical, phased-in approach for achieving accessibility. So lastly, I'd like to real quickly talk about Norway. Norway's fascinating. They're not really part of the EU. They're part of what's called the European Economic Area. So even though they're not part of the EU, they don't have to abide by any of the EU directives, but they invariably adopt all the EU directives, and they usually become a model program when they do it. So it isn't surprising that they do really well when it comes to disability rights. 2001, they created legislation that really was only for employees. They thought, how do we affect employees with disabilities? How do we expand this? They did that by expanding in 2008 to the Anti-Discrimination and Accessibility Act. Then in 2013, they created regulations for ICT accessibility that require WCAG 2.0. It also goes way beyond just websites. It also includes hardware such as computers, kiosks, electronic entry controls, etc., where there are specific ISO standards that affect ICT accessibility. And then they've also imposed fines for private sector entities that don't abide by these standards. The requirements apply after July 1st of 2014 for anything that's new, and for any older existing ICT, the requirements have to be met by January 2021. There's a lot of influence of the ADA on the Norway standards. There's an undue burden defense, for instance, that applies. And so it is quite comprehensive and powerful. It takes questions right now, but I don't have time to, so I should finish up my presentation and take questions at the end. So I hope that this discussion has been useful to you. I wouldn't have been able to put this presentation together without the help of my friends Axel Lebois and James Thurston over at G3ICT. As I mentioned, their organization primarily focuses on implementation of ICT elements of the UN Convention with experts all around the world. If you do a lot of work in worldwide accessibility, they've got a great new accessibility worldview service that you can find by following the URL on the website or by contacting James Thurston over at jthurston@g3ict.org. Many of you may remember James. He used to work over at Microsoft and ITI before joining G3ICT. Second, if you do a lot of work in Europe, I'd recommend that you get a copy of the MEAC report. There's no single compendium of IT accessibility laws and policies around the world, but the MEAC report gives you a pretty good listing of all the relevant laws that pertain to the EU. Third, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, you can get a full transcript of everything I intended to say. This is particularly true for all the stuff that I skipped over in the last couple of slides. You can get that by sending me an email at ken.nakata@cripzone.com. And of course, there is the IAAP community site, which I'd encourage you all to go to. We'll have a special community just for this webinar and for any questions that didn't get answered for the next 2 weeks, but there is also an ongoing international law and policy community site there. Also, I should point out that one thing that's in your handouts is a copy of something that really isn't really specifically tied to this site. If you on your handout page, we've included one of our most popular white papers that talks about the highest priority accessibility errors from a risk perspective. It's called, what is it called? It's called 4 Steps to Readily Achievable Web Accessibility. I borrowed that terminology from the ADA Title III, even though there is no such thing as readily achievable when it comes to website accessibility. The idea is that there are 4 basic things that you can do that keep you out of trouble, and we base this on looking at complaints that were actually filed, that actually got people sued, and we tried to ferret out all the different things that were the factors that got them sued. And so this white paper examines those factors. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. So thanks very much. And thank you for your attention, and hope you have a good day. So if there's any time left, I could take some questions. But.
Ken, we are out of time. We're past the end. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the questions. We have, I think, 4 questions, 4, maybe 5 questions that are in the chat, and I'll post those in the community. So as Ken said, we will open up a community in IAAP Connections, and we'll post those questions there. And Ken, what I'd like to ask you is if you can provide answers to these questions in that community. That way everyone still gets your thoughts on those questions. But I know that we have people who are having to drop off for other commitments, so we are going to have to wrap things up now. So first, I just want to thank you, Ken, for doing such a great job. A ton of information, and I know you probably could have gone on for another hour and a half. There's just so much to cover on this topic, so thank you for doing such a great job. And I also want to thank our captionist, Annette Blau, who did a great job keeping up, because Ken, you had a lot of information to cover. So I'm going to actually move to the slide that shows the link to the feedback survey. We really appreciate getting your feedback, so please do click on this link. We'll also be sending out an email after the webinar, and that will have the link to the feedback survey also. But please do take the time to fill it out. We really pay attention to your thoughts. And I also show here the upcoming webinars. You can go to our website too at accessibilityassociation.org to see what other webinars we have coming up through the end of the year. We do have webinars scheduled through November, actually. So with that, again, I want to remind everybody also in the email that comes out after this webinar, we'll also remind you about the community, but everyone who's registered for the webinar will be automatically enrolled in the webinar community that we open up. So again, Ken, thank you so much. You did a great job, and I'm seeing a lot of thank yous, and I like Thomas's comment, brilliant. So thank you, Ken. Great job.
Oh, thanks very much. It was my pleasure.
So everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day. To exit the webinar, all you need to do is close your browser, hang up the phone, and you'll be out of today's webinar. So thank you, everybody, for attending, and have a great day.